Washington.
Some marginalized people just have too much privacy.
Welcome to the Washington Tech Policy Podcast. We deliver the latest tech policy news and brightest tech policy experts to you, wherever you are, so you can stay productive, relevant, and informed in less time. From Washington, D.C., it's the Washington Tech Policy Podcast with Joe Miller.
DC's Attorney General sues DoorDash for wage theft. What is wage theft, and what are some of the legal mechanisms that employees can use to fight it? Also, Congresswoman Val Demings introduces a bipartisan digital evidence bill, and Michele Gilman is my guest. Hey everybody, DC Attorney General Karl Racine is suing DoorDash for pocketing tips the company solicits from customers. The Office of the Attorney General has been investigating the company since March and now says that evidence shows that DoorDash routinely kept the tips to reduce the amount they had to pay drivers in wages. Florida Congresswoman Val Demings, a Democrat, has introduced new bipartisan legislation to improve law enforcement's access to digital evidence from tech companies. The bill would create a new Office of Digital Law Enforcement within the Department of Justice to train law enforcement on how to handle digital evidence. It would also create a Center for Excellence for Digital Forensics to centralize tech expertise and legal assistance within the same building. The bill would also set up infrastructure for the DOJ to issue digital evidence program grants, as well as a technology policy advisory board to advise the Attorney General on digital evidence best practices. Uber was victorious last week in a sexual assault lawsuit brought against it by a woman who says she was raped near a San Francisco shopping mall last year by a suspended Uber driver who still had the Uber decal on his window. In her pleadings before U.S. Magistrate Judge Jacqueline Scott Corley, the victim claimed that the suspended driver was acting within the scope of his employment and that she legitimately thought it would be a safe ride. But the court disagreed. Judge Corley did find, however, that the victim had made out a plausible claim for negligence and permitted her to refile for punitive damages for negligence stemming from Uber's apparent failure to ensure the driver removed the decal from his window once he was suspended. The driver still faces a criminal trial which could send him away for life. Separately, Uber has begun videotaping rides, but the effort has faced resistance from privacy advocates. West Virginia prisoners will now have to pay 3 cents per minute to access ebooks via Project Gutenberg, which otherwise offers the public free access to over 60,000 books. The West Virginia Division of Corrections and Rehabilitation entered into a deal with Global Tellink to provide tablets to 10 prisons in West Virginia, which will also allow inmates to watch videos and send written messages and photos. But the rates for those services, ranging between 25 cents and 50 cents per minute, are still very high relative to the 4 cents per hour to 58 cents per hour in wages. The prisons will lift a current restriction on accessing books in print, but advocates who oppose the exploitative 3 cents per minute fee for ebooks note that the use of books in print comes with many more restrictions. A Brooklyn landlord has canceled plans to install facial recognition technology after resistance from tenants and advocacy groups. Robert Nelson, president of Nelson Management Group, owns the 700-unit Atlantic Plaza Towers building in Brownsville, where most tenants are black. Tenants and their supporters are now pushing for statewide legislation that would outlaw facial recognition technology throughout the Empire State. Finally, Democratic lawmakers who are members of the House Tech Accountability Caucus, the Tri-Caucus, and the Congressional Black Caucus's Diversity Task Force called out Oracle for its lack of diversity in a letter to Oracle CEO Larry Ellison. The letter notes that Oracle has 0% board diversity, saying it is unacceptable given Oracle's attempts to earn business from firms that serve people of color. And you can find links to all these stories in the show notes. Stay with us.
Washington, the inclusive voice of tech policy. Because America won't stand still for the same old insiders. Washington, moving the needle.
My guest today is Michele Gilman, Venable Professor of Law, Director of Saul Ewing Civil Advocacy Clinic, and co-director of the Center on Applied Feminism at the University of Baltimore School of Law. She's also a faculty fellow at Data and Society in New York, where she focuses on the intersection of data privacy law with the concerns of low-income communities. Please welcome Michele Gilman. Michele, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Joe. It's good to be here.
So a good deal of research is focused on the effects of privacy being inadequately protected. Some of it is focused on how a lack of privacy affects marginalized communities. But your paper entitled The Surveillance Gap, The Harms of Extreme Privacy and Data Marginalization investigates what you have termed a surveillance gap, which is a little different from how we've tended to discuss privacy in the past. What's your thesis here?
Sure. My thesis, along with my co-author, Rebecca Green, is that poor people live at the extremes of the privacy spectrum, either being tracked too much or too little. There's been increasing attention to the fact that poor people lack privacy due to numerous surveillance systems and data-driven technologies. By contrast, in our surveillance gap paper, we focused on a simultaneous reality that some marginalized people just have too much privacy. And by that, we mean they exist outside the big data ecosystem and they're cut off from life-sustaining and mainstream opportunities like employment, housing, education, and social services. In other words, they're functionally invisible.
And so what's causing this?
That's a complex question, but I can briefly highlight 4 causes. First, marginalized people are often left out of data collection. Maybe they lack access to technology, or they fear creating an electronic trail, or they're just overlooked or hard to find. As a result, their needs and perspectives are left out of the policy discussions that hinge on various data sets. Second, there are laws whose entire purpose is to push people out of sight. I'm thinking, for example, of the hundreds of statutes designed to criminalize homelessness, such as statutes that prohibit camping in public, or sleeping in cars. Third, surveillance is used as a form of social control, and as people try to evade surveillance systems, they get pushed underground. Finally, there are people and entities that profit from the surveillance gap, and they have every incentive to maintain it.
What are the different categories, Michele, of marginalized people that you've looked at, and what are some examples of how the surveillance gap has impacted them?
One example comes out of my own legal practice as a clinical law professor. We represent workers who have suffered from wage theft and aren't being paid for their work. Many of these clients are day laborers. They work in an underground economy. That means they don't have employment contracts or pay stubs or time cards or tax reporting forms. Their employers are often off the books too, with no legal status or identifiable address. So in litigating these cases, it can be really hard to prove our clients' entitlement to unpaid wages, or even sometimes to find a defendant to sue. These day laborers don't formally exist as workers, even though they're toiling, usually at very backbreaking jobs and contributing to our economy. Another example is undocumented people living in the United States today. We have a vast surveillance state within the immigration system, and as a result, many undocumented people have been pushed to live their lives in the shadows in order to evade detection. The consequences here are very real. They're terrified about coming into contact with government officials. That means they're unlikely to enforce their legal rights in court, to seek health care, or use banks or other financial institutions. We've seen families pulling their children out of school, staying locked in their homes. This is also a population that suffers very high rates of crime victimization, but they're too scared to report to the police. So these are some of the populations that we discuss in our paper.
Interesting. So what do you think is the central idea that privacy law is based on? How is that definition reinforced, and how has it perpetuated the disparities you've been seeing? And what would you propose as sort of a better way of thinking about privacy law that would be more responsive to the disparities you've discussed here?
Right now, we don't have a comprehensive privacy law in the United States that gives us control over our data. Instead, we primarily live in a notice and consent regime. The assumption here is that people consent to the use of their personal data when they access a website and agree to the terms of service. But the truth is no one reads these policies, which if you did would take 76 days of your life in a year. And even if you did read privacy policies, you have no ability to negotiate their terms. The problem for low-income people is that the harms that flow from this take-it-or-leave-it environment are much more dire than for middle-class and wealthier people. And this may be exactly why we have relatively little regulation to begin with. More affluent Americans just aren't yet experiencing the same level of harms from data-driven technologies. I think we'd be better off with a comprehensive privacy regime that doesn't just put the onus on us as individuals to protect our privacy, which is basically a hopeless task. I've read that, you can choose to stay off Facebook, but they maintain a profile on you nonetheless. So at the end of the day, government and businesses should be legally responsible for collecting and using our data in ways that are fair, transparent, and accountable.
So how do we evolve privacy law and policy without offending, these traditional American notions of liberty and autonomy?
We need to realize that greater privacy can actually promote liberty and autonomy. With greater control over our personal data, we can more fully live our lives as we choose and fulfill our potential, rather than being categorized and segmented and manipulated. To really protect our autonomy and liberty, the law should require that the digital technologies that increasingly impact us and govern us include methods for public participation and input. We should have a say in these vast systems that are shaping our lives, and we need all voices at the table, not just those of experts and elites.
Well, Michele, it's been wonderful having you on the show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now we'll do an icebreaker question and hear about the best career advice you've heard and what you're reading and watching these days. Okay, so it's time for this week's icebreaker. What incredibly common thing have you never done?
I have never played an online or app-based video game. And it's ironic because I spend a lot of time thinking about data and technology, but I don't interact with the entertainment side of technology.
Interesting. So not even like any of the word games or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm not even playing Candy Crush.
Interesting. Mine is a game too, but it's a little more controversial and, maybe a little career limiting. But I've never played golf. And not only have I never played it, I don't have any interest in playing it either. But in any case, what's the best piece of career advice you've ever received?
The best advice I got as a young lawyer was to plan my career and finances so that I could pursue opportunities that aligned with my passions and values and not be trapped by a paycheck. You hear a lot about unhappy lawyers, but I am a 100% happy lawyer because I care so deeply about the work that I'm doing with my students.
That's inspiring. As a lawyer myself, it can be discouraging because I think we're trained to think very pessimistically, and sometimes that can translate into other areas of our lives.
That's definitely true.
What are you reading these days?
Well, I just got a copy of Ruha Benjamin's book, Race After Technology, after hearing her speak, and I'm very excited to gain a deeper understanding of what she terms, quote, the new Jim Code, or the ways in which discriminatory technological designs can encode and magnify existing racial inequalities.
Crucial topics, especially as we consider the impact that Facebook is having and some of their policies. I know a lot of the civil rights groups are concerned about the way they treat political ads, for example. Well, thanks again,
Absolutely.
Michele, for joining me. What are some final ideas you'd like to leave with the audience before we close, and where can we find you online?
I think it's important to be aware that not everyone experiences technology and privacy the same way. We can't just import middle class or elite norms into privacy laws and policy and think that we're meeting the needs of the entire population. The people being harmed the most by a lack of robust privacy law are the people with the least political power and the least resources to fight back. This is impacting their ability to access homes, education, employment, and the like. At the end of the day, this is so much more than about privacy. It's a matter of economic justice. So to learn more about this, you could follow me on Twitter at Prof. M. Gilman, or find my writings, including the surveillance gap, on SSRN or on my faculty webpage.
You've been listening to Michele Gilman, Venable Professor of Law, Director of the Saul Ewing Civil Advocacy Clinic, and Co-Director of the Center on Applied Feminism at the University of Baltimore School of Law. Michele, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And that concludes episode 211 of the podcast. Thanks so much for listening. If you like what we do, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment, head over to Apple Podcasts, give it a review. It helps others know what they can expect from the show and really helps us out. Happy Thanksgiving. I will be out next Tuesday, but I will see you again here the following week. Take care.
Washington Tech.